Congratulations, Victor. You earned this. Thank you, sir.
For years, Victor Hayes believed that hard work always led to something better. He arrived before sunrise, stayed long after everyone else had gone home, missed birthdays, skipped vacations, and quietly accepted every extra responsibility that landed on his desk. At 33 years old, he had become the employee everyone depended on, but few truly noticed. Then, on a rainy Monday morning in Seattle, everything changed. The announcement echoed through the company's headquarters. Victor had been promoted to operations director, one of the youngest executives in the firm's history. Applause filled the room. Co-workers shook his hand. Some smiled with genuine excitement, while others forced congratulations through clenched teeth. His new office overlooked the city skyline. His salary had nearly doubled overnight, and his security badge now granted access to floors he had never been allowed to enter before. It looked like the ending every hard-working employee hopes for. But what happened during the next few minutes would erase every reason Victor had ever had to celebrate. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because today's story is about a promotion that became a burden, a conversation that could never be forgotten, and a decision that placed one ordinary man between success and the truth. Victor stepped out of the elevator onto the executive floor with a mixture of excitement and disbelief. The atmosphere felt different from every other level in the building. The conversations were quieter. The hallways seemed almost untouched by the usual rush of corporate life. Expensive artwork covered the walls, polished glass reflected the morning sunlight, and every office door carried the name of someone whose decisions affected thousands of employees. Several executives welcomed Victor with warm smiles, offering handshakes and words of encouragement that made him believe he had finally earned a place among them. His new office was larger than his old apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked downtown Seattle, and a polished wooden desk stood in the center of the room beside shelves already stocked with reports waiting for his attention. An assistant handed him a folder containing details of his new compensation package. The salary increase was beyond anything he had imagined. Stock options, performance bonuses, company privileges. It was the kind of opportunity people spent entire careers chasing. As Victor looked around the office, he allowed himself one brief moment to think about his parents, who had worked multiple jobs to give him a chance at a better future. Every sacrifice suddenly felt worthwhile. The celebration continued throughout the morning. Department heads stopped by to introduce themselves. Messages of congratulations filled Victor's inbox faster than he could read them. His phone buzzed constantly with friends and former coworkers celebrating the news. Everything pointed toward the beginning of a remarkable new chapter. Yet, even during those first hours, small details began catching his attention. Conversations seemed to end whenever he approached. Two senior executives exchanged uneasy glances after noticing his new access badge. A finance manager quickly removed several files from a conference table the moment Victor entered the room. None of it seemed important by itself, and Victor convinced himself he was simply adjusting to executive life. Large companies often operated differently behind closed doors. He had no reason to question it. At least, not yet. Just before noon, his assistant appeared at the doorway with a simple message that would change everything. "Miss Claire Monroe would like to see you in her office. She said to come alone." Victor straightened his jacket, grabbed his notebook out of habit, and walked toward the CEO's private office, believing he was about to receive advice from the woman who had personally approved his promotion. Claire Monroe greeted him with the same calm professionalism that had made her one of the most respected executives in the industry. At 41, she had built a reputation for leading the company through difficult economic times while protecting thousands of jobs. Investors admired her judgment. Employees trusted her leadership. The media often described her as one of America's most disciplined business leaders. She smiled warmly as Victor entered, congratulated him once again, and invited him to sit across from her desk. For a brief moment, everything felt completely normal. Then Claire stood, walked quietly to the office door, and locked it. The soft click of the lock echoed through the room, far louder than it should have. She returned to her desk, but the confidence that usually defined her expression had disappeared. Her smile faded. She looked directly at Victor for several silent seconds before speaking in a voice so controlled that it almost sounded rehearsed. "There's something you need to know, and once I tell you, your life will never be the same." Victor gave a nervous laugh, assuming she was about to discuss confidential executive responsibilities. Claire didn't laugh with him. Instead, she slowly reached into the bottom drawer of her desk and removed an old, worn folder that looked completely out of place among the modern surroundings. She placed it gently on the polished wood between them and pushed it toward Victor. The folder contained documents that should never have existed together. And before Victor had even turned the first page, he realized his promotion had never been about rewarding years of loyalty. It had been the first step into a secret that someone had protected for far too long. Victor Hayes had imagined this moment 1,000 different ways, but none of those imagined versions came close to reality. At 33 years old, he had just received the promotion that every ambitious employee inside Monroe Logistics dreamed about. After years of arriving before everyone else and leaving long after sunset, he had finally broken through the invisible barrier separating ordinary employees from the company's executive leadership. The announcement spread through headquarters like wildfire. Emails poured into his inbox. Co-workers stopped him in hallways. Managers who had barely spoken to him before suddenly treated him like an equal. For the first time in his career, Victor felt seen. He felt respected. Most importantly, he felt secure. The larger office, the increased salary, and the executive title represented everything he had worked toward since joining the company nearly 8 years earlier. Looking out from the floor-to-ceiling windows of his new office, Victor allowed himself to believe that the difficult years were finally behind him. What he didn't know was that his promotion had less to do with his future and far more to do with someone else's past. As the afternoon continued, Victor found himself adjusting to his new responsibilities. His access badge now opened doors that had always remained locked. He attended executive meetings where major decisions were discussed. He reviewed confidential reports detailing company operations across multiple states. Everything felt exciting, yet something about the executive floor seemed strangely uncomfortable. The smiles were there. The handshakes were there. The congratulations were there. But beneath the surface, Victor sensed a tension he couldn't explain. Several executives seemed nervous whenever certain topics were mentioned. During one meeting, a senior board member abruptly changed the subject when financial records from 10 years earlier appeared on a presentation screen. Another executive quickly shut down questions regarding a former division that no longer existed. Victor noticed these moments, but assumed there were reasonable explanations. Every large company had sensitive subjects. Every corporation had complicated history. At least, that was what he told himself. The truth was that the people around him weren't worried about company history. They were worried about someone discovering it. The strange feeling grew stronger after his meeting with Claire Monroe. The worn folder still sat in front of him as he returned to his office. His heart pounded as he opened it again. Inside were photographs, financial records, legal correspondence, and handwritten notes dating back nearly a decade. At first glance, the documents seemed unrelated. But as Victor studied them more carefully, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Several names appeared repeatedly throughout the file. Company executives, former managers, consultants who had worked with Monroe Logistics years earlier. Mixed among the paperwork were newspaper clippings covering a tragic industrial accident that had occurred outside Portland, Oregon, almost 10 years before. According to public records, the accident had been investigated and closed. Responsibility had been assigned. Settlements had been paid. The case had disappeared from public attention. Yet the documents inside Claire's folder suggested that important pieces of the story had never been revealed. Victor couldn't understand why Claire was showing him this information now. More importantly, he couldn't understand why she looked so afraid while doing it. Late that evening, most employees had already gone home when Victor finally gathered enough courage to return to Claire's office. He found her standing alone near the window overlooking the city. The confidence that usually defined her leadership seemed absent. She looked tired, older somehow, like someone carrying a weight that had become impossible to hide. Victor asked the question that had been haunting him since opening the folder. "Why are you showing me this?" Claire remained silent for several seconds before answering. She explained that some secrets become heavier with time rather than lighter. She admitted that she had spent years convincing herself she could protect everyone involved while keeping the truth hidden. But recently, circumstances had changed. People were asking questions again. Old records were resurfacing. Former employees were speaking to reporters. The carefully constructed wall surrounding the past was beginning to crack. Victor listened carefully, expecting her to reveal everything. Instead, she stopped short of providing answers. She told him only what he needed to know. Powerful people would do almost anything to ensure certain facts never became public. When Victor finally left the office that night, Seattle's streets were nearly empty. Rain tapped softly against the windshield as he drove home, replaying every detail of the conversation in his mind. Something felt wrong, not just with the documents, but with the entire situation. Why him? Why promote him into the executive ranks only to expose him to such a dangerous secret? As he pulled into the parking garage beneath his apartment building, he noticed a black SUV parked near the entrance. The vehicle's engine was running. Its windows were dark. Victor paid little attention at first, assuming it belonged to another resident. But as he stepped out of his car, he noticed the SUV slowly pulling away. It exited the garage without parking, without stopping, without anyone getting out. Victor stood motionless, watching the vehicle disappear into the night. A chill moved through him despite the warm summer air. It was probably nothing. A coincidence. At least, that's what he wanted to believe. Because what Victor didn't realize was that the moment Claire handed him that folder, he had become part of a story much larger than himself. And somewhere in the shadows, someone already knew it. Victor Hayes barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the worn folder sitting on Claire Monroe's desk and heard her warning repeating in his mind. "There's something you need to know, and once I tell you, your life will never be the same." By sunrise, he had convinced himself there had to be a logical explanation for everything he had seen. Large corporations dealt with lawsuits, confidential settlements, and sensitive financial matters all the time. Perhaps Claire simply trusted him enough to prepare him for the responsibilities that came with his new position. But the more Victor tried to convince himself of that, the less believable it sounded. Before leaving for work, he opened the notebook where he had copied several names and dates from memory after returning home. One name kept appearing throughout the documents: Ethan Caldwell, a former chief financial officer who had resigned almost 10 years earlier without any public explanation. Victor searched his memory, but couldn't remember anyone inside the company ever mentioning him. It was as though Ethan Caldwell had simply disappeared from Monroe Logistics history. That silence disturbed Victor almost as much as the documents themselves. When Victor arrived at headquarters, the atmosphere felt noticeably different from the previous day. People still congratulated him on his promotion, but the conversations ended quickly. Several executives who had welcomed him so warmly now avoided eye contact altogether. During the morning leadership meeting, Claire appeared composed, presenting quarterly reports with the confidence everyone expected from the company's CEO. No one in the room would have guessed that only hours earlier she had shared information capable of destroying careers. Victor studied the faces around the conference table. Some appeared relaxed. Others looked unusually tense whenever Claire mentioned company records from previous years. Then, halfway through the meeting, one board member interrupted her presentation and casually suggested that all archived financial documents be transferred to an outside storage facility for efficiency. The request sounded ordinary, yet Victor immediately remembered seeing many of those same archived records inside Claire's folder. Victor felt his stomach tighten as he turned page after page. Every new document answered one question while creating 3 more. He looked at Claire and asked the question he had been holding back since entering the room. "If you've known all this for years, why didn't you expose them?" Claire lowered her eyes before answering. She admitted that when she became CEO, she inherited not only the company, but also the consequences of decisions made long before she reached the executive office. At first, she believed she could quietly gather enough evidence to hold the responsible people accountable without destroying Monroe Logistics and the thousands of innocent employees whose livelihoods depended on it. But every attempt had been blocked. Witnesses suddenly refused to cooperate. Important records disappeared. Former executives accepted generous retirement packages on the condition that they remained silent. Others simply vanished from public view. Claire confessed that she had lived with the burden every single day, believing she could eventually correct the past. Instead, the secret only became heavier. Now someone inside the company had discovered she was collecting evidence again, and that person was moving quickly to stop her. As Victor prepared to leave the records room, Claire handed him a small encrypted flash drive containing digital copies of several critical files. She instructed him to keep it somewhere no one would ever think to look and warned him never to access it using company computers. Victor slipped the drive into his pocket, still struggling to understand why Claire had chosen him instead of lawyers, investigators, or law enforcement. Before he could ask another question, Claire looked directly into his eyes and quietly said, "Because I don't know who I can trust anymore." Those words followed Victor all the way home. But before he even reached his apartment, another unsettling event confirmed Claire's fears. His phone suddenly displayed multiple security alerts showing failed attempts to access his personal email, banking accounts, and cloud storage from unknown locations. Moments later, an unfamiliar number sent him a single text message containing only 8 chilling words. "Congratulations on your promotion. Stop asking questions while you still can." Victor stared at the screen, his pulse racing. Until that moment, the secret had existed only inside company walls. Now it had reached his personal life, and whoever was watching him wanted him to understand one thing very clearly. He was no longer simply an executive. He had become a target. Victor Hayes spent the entire weekend trying to convince himself that the anonymous text message was nothing more than an intimidation tactic. He had told no one about the encrypted flash drive Claire Monroe had given him, and he had followed her instructions exactly. He never connected it to his home computer, never carried it openly, and never mentioned it to friends or family. Yet someone had known enough to send a warning only hours after he left the company's secure records room. That realization kept replaying in his mind. If someone knew he had been trusted with confidential information, then someone inside Monroe Logistics was watching far more than employee performance. They were watching people. Every conversation, every meeting, every unexpected movement seemed to matter. By Monday morning, Victor walked into headquarters with a smile on his face, but behind that smile was a man quietly studying everyone around him. He wasn't looking for guilt anymore. He was looking for fear. Fear often revealed itself in ways words never could. A nervous glance across a conference table. A conversation that stopped the moment another person entered the room. A file quickly closed before someone could read its contents. The executive floor looked exactly the same as it had the week before, yet Victor now saw it through completely different eyes. The first unusual event happened before lunchtime. Victor received an invitation to attend a strategic planning session with several board members, including Richard Lawson, one of the company's longest-serving directors. Richard had built a reputation as a calm, experienced businessman who had helped Monroe Logistics expand across the United States. During the meeting, Richard congratulated Victor on his promotion and spoke warmly about the importance of loyalty within executive leadership. His words sounded encouraging, but something about the conversation felt rehearsed. As the meeting ended, Richard placed a hand on Victor's shoulder and smiled. "The higher you climb," he said, "the more important it becomes to understand which questions are worth asking and which ones are better left alone." Everyone in the room laughed politely, treating the comment as harmless advice. Victor forced a smile as well, but inside, he felt a wave of uneasiness. Richard had no reason to say those words unless he suspected Victor was already searching for answers. Walking back to his office, Victor replayed the conversation repeatedly. Was it simply corporate wisdom, or had it been a carefully disguised warning? Determined to learn more, Victor began researching people whose names appeared inside Claire's documents. One former employee stood out above all the others. Daniel Mercer had served as a senior safety engineer during the years leading up to the transportation accident. Company records showed he had resigned only weeks after the investigation concluded. Public records revealed very little about his life afterward, except that he had moved to a small town outside Spokane, Washington. After several days of hesitation, Victor decided to make the drive himself. Daniel lived quietly in a modest house surrounded by tall pine trees, far removed from the corporate world he had once known. At first, the retired engineer refused to discuss Monroe Logistics. But after Victor mentioned Claire Monroe's name and quietly admitted he had seen the old investigation files, Daniel's expression changed. He invited Victor inside and disappeared into another room before returning with a dusty cardboard box that had clearly remained untouched for years. Inside were copies of inspection reports, maintenance requests, and handwritten notes documenting repeated warnings about failing transportation equipment months before the accident. Daniel explained that several engineers had pleaded for repairs, but executives rejected every request because replacing the equipment would have delayed a major expansion project worth hundreds of millions of dollars. People like to believe disasters happen because nobody saw them coming, Daniel said softly. The hardest truth is that sometimes people see them coming and decide the cost of preventing them is too high. Victor left Daniel's house, carrying far more than additional evidence. He carried confirmation that Claire had been telling the truth from the very beginning. But before he reached the highway, he noticed the same black SUV he had seen outside his apartment several nights earlier. It remained several vehicles behind him, never getting close enough to draw attention, yet never disappearing completely. Victor tested his suspicion by taking an unexpected exit toward a quiet residential neighborhood. The SUV followed. He turned again onto another road. It followed once more before finally pulling away only after Victor stopped near a busy shopping center filled with people. Standing beside his car, Victor watched the vehicle disappear into traffic. He couldn't identify the driver because the windows remained heavily tinted, but one fact had become impossible to ignore. This was no coincidence. Someone was tracking his movements with remarkable precision. The question was no longer whether he was being watched. The question was why the people following him hadn't acted already. That evening, Victor returned to his apartment and immediately searched every room for signs that someone had entered while he was away. Nothing appeared disturbed. The doors were still locked. The windows remained secure. Yet when he opened the kitchen drawer where he had hidden the encrypted flash drive inside an old flashlight, he froze. The flashlight had been moved. Only slightly, just enough for someone familiar with the room to notice. Victor carefully opened it. The flash drive was still inside. Whoever had entered hadn't taken it. They wanted Victor to know they could have. His hands trembled as he closed the drawer. Moments later, his phone rang. The caller ID displayed no number. Victor answered without speaking. After several seconds of silence, a calm male voice finally said, "You should have enjoyed your promotion, Victor. Now you're carrying someone else's mistakes." The line went dead before Victor could respond. Standing alone in his apartment, he realized the promotion he had celebrated only days earlier had quietly transformed into something else entirely. He wasn't climbing the corporate ladder anymore. He was walking through a carefully guarded past that powerful people were determined to keep hidden, no matter who had to be silenced along the way. Victor Hayes no longer recognized the life he had been living only a week earlier. The excitement of becoming operations director had disappeared, replaced by a constant awareness that every decision he made might already be known by someone else. He changed his daily routine, drove different routes to work, and stopped discussing anything important over the phone. Even inside Monroe Logistics, he avoided carrying confidential documents, choosing instead to memorize key details before locking every file away. Claire Monroe had warned him that she trusted almost no one, and Victor was beginning to understand why. The people responsible for protecting the company's reputation had spent years protecting themselves instead. They had resources, influence, and access to information most people could never imagine. Yet despite the pressure building around him, Victor refused to walk away. Every document he had read, every conversation he had experienced, and every warning he had received convinced him that too many innocent people had already paid the price for decisions they never made. If he remained silent now, he would become part of the same cover-up that had haunted the company for nearly a decade. Late one evening, Claire contacted Victor using a prepaid phone she had purchased with cash. She instructed him to meet her at a quiet marina several miles outside downtown Seattle after sunset. When Victor arrived, Claire was already waiting beside an empty dock overlooking the water. She looked exhausted. The confident executive who had inspired employees for years now appeared like someone carrying the weight of countless sleepless nights. Without wasting time, she handed Victor another sealed envelope. Inside were signed statements from two former executives who had secretly admitted that board members knowingly approved the safety budget cuts before the transportation accident. The statements had never been submitted to investigators because both executives had accepted confidential settlement agreements in exchange for their silence. Claire explained that she had spent years tracking down people connected to the case, quietly collecting evidence while pretending to move on with business as usual. She had believed she was getting close to exposing the truth, but everything changed 3 days earlier. Someone had broken into her private office after midnight. Nothing valuable had been stolen. Only one cabinet had been opened, the cabinet containing records related to the old investigation. Whoever entered wasn't looking for money. They were searching for evidence. That meant someone inside the company had finally realized Claire intended to reveal everything. The following morning, Monroe Logistics announced an emergency board meeting. Every executive was required to attend. Victor immediately sensed that something was wrong. The atmosphere inside the conference room was unusually tense. Several directors exchanged quiet conversations before Claire entered. As the meeting began, Richard Lawson unexpectedly proposed an internal compliance review, claiming anonymous concerns had been raised regarding executive confidentiality. On the surface, the proposal sounded routine. But Victor quickly realized its true purpose when another director suggested that all executive laptops, company phones, and office files be collected immediately for inspection. The room fell silent. Claire calmly objected, reminding the board that such actions required independent legal oversight. Her response was met with polite smiles that failed to hide growing frustration. Victor watched carefully as Richard's eyes moved around the room, almost as if he were measuring everyone's reaction. For the first time since receiving his promotion, Victor understood that this was no longer simply about protecting old secrets. Someone believed evidence still existed, and they intended to find it before Claire or Victor could take it outside the company. That evening, Victor returned home to discover his apartment door slightly open. His pulse quickened as he stepped inside. Furniture had been moved. Desk drawers were left open. Closet shelves had been emptied onto the floor. Yet expensive electronics remained untouched. Cash hidden inside a kitchen cabinet was still there. Whoever entered had ignored everything of financial value. They had searched only for documents, storage devices, or anything connected to the company's past. Victor immediately checked the hiding place where he had once kept Claire's encrypted flash drive. It was empty, but not because someone had stolen it. 2 days earlier, acting on instinct, Victor had moved it to a safe deposit box at a local bank after noticing he was being followed again. Whoever searched his apartment had arrived too late. As Victor stood quietly examining the damage, he noticed a single sheet of paper resting on his dining table. There were no fingerprints, no signature, just one typed sentence. Some truths destroy everyone who touches them. For a long moment, Victor simply stared at the message. It wasn't just a threat. It was a reminder that the people behind the cover-up still believed fear would silence anyone who came too close. Victor drove directly to Claire's home without calling first. When she opened the door, she immediately knew something had happened. After listening to everything, she finally revealed the one piece of the story she had kept hidden from him. Nearly 10 years earlier, before becoming CEO, she had served as executive vice president. When the transportation accident occurred, she had discovered evidence proving that senior board members knowingly ignored repeated safety warnings. She wanted to report everything to federal investigators immediately, but she was persuaded to wait while outside attorneys conducted what they described as an independent review. That review never happened. Instead, evidence disappeared, witnesses changed their statements, and lower-level employees accepted blame for decisions they never made. Claire admitted that her greatest mistake wasn't causing the tragedy. It was believing she could expose the truth later without risking the future of the company and the livelihoods of thousands of innocent workers. She had spent years trying to repair that mistake quietly, but every delay gave the people responsible more time to erase evidence and strengthen their influence. Looking directly at Victor, she said something he would never forget. "The moment I handed you that folder, I knew neither of us would ever have a normal life again. But if we stop now, everyone who suffered because of their decisions will remain nothing more than a forgotten footnote in company history." Victor nodded slowly. The fear was still there, but so was something stronger. He finally understood that this story had never been about a promotion. It had always been about choosing between comfort and conscience. And there was no turning back. Victor Hayes understood that once the next step was taken, there would be no opportunity to reverse it. Every piece of evidence Claire Monroe had collected over the years, every witness statement, every financial record, and every internal email pointed toward the same conclusion. The transportation accident that had changed so many lives had not been an unavoidable tragedy. It had been the result of deliberate decisions made by people who believed protecting profits mattered more than protecting people. For years, those responsible had relied on silence, legal agreements, and influence to keep the truth hidden. They assumed time would erase the memories of those affected, and that no one inside Monroe Logistics would ever challenge the official story. They were wrong. Victor and Claire agreed that the evidence could no longer remain inside company walls. Instead of trusting the board or the company's legal department, they arranged a confidential meeting with federal investigators through an attorney who specialized in corporate whistleblower cases. Every document was copied, verified, and secured in multiple locations before anyone outside their small circle learned what was happening. If one set of evidence disappeared, another would survive. For the first time in years, Claire felt that the truth finally had a chance to be heard. Within days, investigators quietly began reviewing thousands of pages of internal records. They interviewed former employees, engineers, accountants, and executives who had long since left Monroe Logistics. Some witnesses were reluctant at first, fearing legal consequences or damage to their reputations. Claire Monroe made the most difficult decision of her professional life. Rather than waiting to be called before investigators, she voluntarily resigned as chief executive officer and publicly acknowledged her own failure to expose the truth sooner. She accepted responsibility for remaining silent, even though she had not been among those who approved the decisions that caused the tragedy. During a brief public statement, she explained that leadership required more than protecting a company's success. It required protecting the people whose lives depended on that success. She admitted that fear of destroying the company had influenced her judgment for years, and that fear had allowed others to continue hiding behind carefully crafted explanations. Her resignation shocked employees across the country. Many who had admired her leadership struggled to understand why she would step away at the height of her career. Only later, as more evidence became public, did people begin to appreciate the burden she had carried for so many years. Victor watched the announcement from his office in complete silence. He knew better than anyone that Claire's decision had cost her everything she had built, yet it had also given countless families something they had almost lost forever: the truth. Several months later, the investigation concluded with multiple criminal charges against former executives directly involved in approving the cost-cutting decisions and concealing critical evidence. Monroe Logistics survived under completely new leadership after implementing sweeping reforms designed to prevent similar failures in the future. Victor declined offers to remain in senior management, choosing instead to leave corporate life behind. The experience had permanently changed the way he viewed success. One quiet afternoon, while packing the final items from his office, he discovered an envelope addressed to him in Claire's handwriting. Inside was a short note that read, "Promotions can change a career. Integrity changes a life. Thank you for choosing the harder path." Victor folded the note carefully and placed it inside his jacket before walking through the lobby for the last time. Employees who passed him had no idea how close the company had come to losing far more than its reputation. As the elevator doors closed behind him, Victor realized the promotion he had once celebrated had never been a reward. It had been a test of character. The title, the office, and the salary had all disappeared from his life, but one thing remained. He could finally look in the mirror knowing that when the truth depended on someone willing to stand alone, he chose courage over comfort. And perhaps the greatest lesson of all is this: the most dangerous secrets are rarely protected by locked doors or hidden files. They survive because ordinary people convince themselves that staying silent is easier than doing what is right. If this story made you think, ask yourself one question. If your dream promotion came with a secret that could change countless lives, what would you have done? Let us know your answer in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the Story Chamber for more gripping stories inspired by real-life corporate scandals, mysteries, and unforgettable human decisions. Until next time, thank you for watching. We appreciate every one of you.